Otherwise you get a riot on your hands, you see.
Suresh Gupta from New World Newspaper. My question is that terrorism is a big problem all over the world. And terrorism exists only for two reasons. One is somebody is financing it, and secondly, people close to the terrorists are hiding information. So the question comes to, how can we cut off the finance to terrorists, number one, and number two, how can we encourage their family members and relations to cooperate with the authorities to deal with them?
Okay, this gentleman. Thank you. Just over here.
Taimur Iqbal from Prime TV. Couple of questions from Ms. Emma and Dr. Osama as well. Having worked with charities on my TV channel for a good 10, 12 years, I can pretty much confirm a lot of things Emma has said. The question is, Emma, that Charity Commission, I have personally felt working with the charities has not been able to do a sufficient job of monitoring how they are diverting their funds to the projects in Pakistan, because a lot of charities that I've worked with, they were mostly working, philanthropic work in Pakistan. So how can Charity Commission further strengthen its monitoring mechanism? Secondly, a BBC survey that I read a few years ago was about the quality of British imams. The survey suggested that about 80% of the imams could not either speak English or had a very poor grip of English language. A lot of them were not actually British citizens or not born Britishers who had come from, immigrated from different countries. So my question is that should there be a particular criteria to become an imam in a British mosque if no such criteria already exists? And if there is a criteria, what exactly are those tick boxes, which specific credentials I'm talking about, which are required or should be required to become a mosque imam in Britain?
Thank you. That's a great series of questions. What I want to do is go right down the panel, answer what you can. There was an element that you said in your talk, Emma, this was about the broadcasting, that there are complications why they can't be deregistered. Mm-hmm. And now we've got a very good question here is, are there complications on how to cut the finance? So the questions that we're dealing with is how to cut the finance, how can families be persuaded to bring their offspring into line? What about the Charity Commission in that? And should there be a criteria to become an imam?
Finance and the Charity Commission are my two favourite topics
and keep it
to
short.
talk about. So, on the finance side of things, one of the most obvious things, and there are so many things we could talk about from foreign funding in Qatar or Saudi, but actually I think the most obvious thing that we can do to help deal with the finance issue is making sure that they're not getting taxpayer money. Because in 2018, I calculated that in the 2015 to 16 financial year, they had received more than a small selection, so only the tip of the iceberg, of concerning charities had received more than 6 million in taxpayer money through gift aid, and that doesn't count the money that came from the European Commission or money that came through international grants, for example, DFID and UK Aid. And recently also tallied up that it was about 5 million, and that was on even more patchy information. So, I mean, it's just a sort of glimpse, but a lot of money is coming through taxpayers. So
but going to legal charities because they haven't been deregistered.
Are legal because, and that leads on to the second problem, because obviously HMRC will provide taxpayer money to charities that are UK registered charities, but the problem is that the powers available to the Charity Commission through charity law to actually deal with charities, for many good reasons, are actually quite limited. And though they got more powers in 2016 through the Charity Act, for example, now they're able to more easily deal with trustees. If there is a charity that is sort of bad through and through, you can remove all of the trustees and it will still sort of tick along as normal. So there are issues to do with trying to basically beef up charity law, I think, is what it boils down to, and finding ways to cut off taxpayer money getting to these charities.
Okay, great for that. Bill, could you add to that, perhaps the family bit as well?
Well, actually, what I wanted to do was pick up on what Emma's presented to us, because actually, I'm a great fan of Emma's writing, which I follow avidly. But let's recall that she said at the beginning, these individuals present themselves as large and representative, and they inflate their influence. And then her whole talk appears to have been to make them sound large and representative and inflate their influence. If I were to read out a list of staff who work for the BBC and their charity connections, we could be here all night. Actually, we need to remind ourselves that whatever list is going to be read out about Islamist-related charities and individuals, it pales into insignificance compared to the size of the British state. The £6 million that Emma just mentioned as being gift-aided is nothing, as I'm sure most of you realise, in relation to the average government ministry budget for a week, let alone anything else. So, whilst no doubt there are individuals who should be paying attention to that part of the spectrum which Emma is discussing, and she's clearly one of them, my concern is it fails to address something else, which is, why is it that such tiny, insignificant, irrelevant, marginal individuals and institutions appear to have significant purchase, traction, and attraction amongst a wider layer of young individuals? She also mentioned the influence of Zakir Naik in her talk, but surely the point in response to that is that shouldn't we be hoping to influence young people? Isn't that the role of education and moral values in society? And we're concerned about small numbers of people influencing people in a particular direction, whilst never clarifying what it is that we want to influence young people to believe in, belong to, and look forward to. So I think that's my concern. And then the logical conclusion, of course, that comes from all this is that we need to ban, scrutinize, monitor all of these individuals and influences, which is the very opposite of the free, open, and democratic society that many people in this room came to this country buying into, however long ago it was that you first came here. A lot of individuals here, and I was speaking to one at the table I was sat at earlier, left Pakistan in order to get away from a lot of what they now see the British state as building and celebrating here on his supposed behalf.
Okay, well, I'm sure you two can battle that out for the next 20 years in academia. Usama, could you address the criteria for imams particularly? 'Cause we need an answer to that question.
Very quickly, I'd like to pick on bigger issues, actually. But Imams Online, which is UK government funded fully, are having a seminar on the 2nd of October, their annual seminar now. And that's one of the topics precisely. What are the criteria as an imam? I mean, I served as an imam for 35 years. I'm a scientist. I was an astronomer. I'm still an astronomer. Royal Observatory, Greenwich, all the rest. I was forced out of my mosque. And I'm not invited to Imams Online because apparently I'm too radical in talking about extremism. So it's an idea. But I would recommend, they're the good people. Now I'm going to echo what Bill said, and with the greatest respect, Emma, and the forum, I'd like to say something. We've talked about Islamophobia. One thing which is not mentioned often, the official definition of anti-Semitism, including from the Israeli government, says that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. But singling Israel out for criticism is anti-Semitic. And I actually agree with that. And I would apply it to religions, is that we had it at the beginning of the chair, must be able to discuss Islam. Yeah, absolutely. But what I do believe is that similarly, singling Islam out for this kind of criticism is Islamophobic, and that's what's happening in our public discourse.
Could I just...
No.
Because the question is specifically, I mean, we're not doing another panel. The question was specifically came from here, and the gentleman wanted to know if there should be a criteria, particularly of language, to be an imam in Britain. And I think we would like to know your view on that.
Oh, my view would be that the imam should have the qualification to serve the community. And when the mosques were set up, most of the congregation was only speaking Urdu or Bengali or whatever. Obviously, that's changed now. And 90% or more speak English. And we introduced that in our mosque. We changed Friday sermons. We were one of the first in London to change Friday sermons from Urdu to English, for example, with a lot of resistance. But I just wanted to continue on the issue, because this is a wider issue and this is important. I disagree with Emma's definition of Islamism, because you could apply exactly the same to, say, Christian values. Margaret Thatcher had Christian values, Cameron had Christian values. He said, we're a Christian country. Theresa May is the daughter of a vicar. Obama, Reagan, Bush, all of these guys had Christian values, and they brought that to government, Tony Blair as well. It's actually a complete mistake to say Muslims should not bring their values to their democratic
I think
activism.
we're getting a little off to... We've got 3 questioners here, and I know you've got a lot to say, and there's time afterwards. Could we just take the questions?
No, but I believe you're censoring issues, and you've allowed my colleagues to speak on this, and this is very important issues here. So I would just like to finish on this, is that there's a wider issue. You know, yes, there's an ecosystem of Islamism, as there is of Zionism. Modi is arguably a Hindutva extremist and terrorist. Netanyahu is a Zionist extremist. He quoted the Torah to oppose the peace process, which Rabin
Osama, these aren't the questions. I'm going to have to stop you
but these
here.
are issues, and
They are issues,
I
but
wish
they're
you had
not
more
the
courage.
question.
I wish you had more courage to
We
deal with
should-
this and not
it's
walk on
not the
eggshells.
courage to deal with
No,
it,
no,
it's that
to
we've
walk
got
on
people
eggshells.
from the floor that want to join in the debate. Over here.
Priyajit, I'm an author on non-fiction. My question is to Emma about the like TV channels which are not fundamentally Islamic, something like KTV, which also emanates the threat of terrorism from British soil, and they align to the Islamic identity in the bigger picture of the deep state. So what would you say
This
about
is the television channels that
It's
Emma
like
was talking
Khalistani
about,
TV,
and what...
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Quick question over here and over here. We're going to do 3, and then we're going to do a wrap-up, and then we're going to go to Barry Gardner after that to tell us what we've been... This gentleman's got the microphone, so let him do it. Be very quick, and then pass it to the lady.
It was really about domestic extremism, so the term domestic extremism. A lack of definition seems to be floating around. I mean, there's no universal definition of terrorism, and then when we start talking about non-violent extremism, we're into an even murkier area. I'm sorry, Richard Wall, University of Greenwich. I teach a master's course on crime, terrorism in the state. I had a student a couple of years ago. I set them a project to look at a terrorist organisation, and she looked at the Suffragettes, a non-violent extremist organisation. So I think there's some real kind of concerns
So
there.
your question is the definition of extremism.
Yeah, and I just want to also say, given what's emerging around spy cops and green politicians, environmentalists, union activists, all having been spied on by the state as domestic extremists.
Yeah.
So.
I just wanted to question for Osama that if we trained all the imams in Britain, would that help the situation?
Good question. Okay. Let's go left to right again, considering the flack you got, Emma, from that. If you could just be very brief on the question about the Islamic television channels, and then define for us extremism. At what stage should they be closed down or people move against?
I'm not sure I'm up to the task of defining extremism, but I can actually roll my response into what has been said directly to me into my answer to both questions. Actually, I'm not sure about the TV channel question, but on the one about extremism. So firstly, the definition of Islamism wasn't my definition of Islamism, and I did say we could argue about it until the cows come home, because there are all sorts of things that can be said about that. But that was the government definition of extremism, and I actually agree probably more than you realise, Bill, with everything that you said during your talk, because I am extremely anxious about free speech situations in this country, and I agree with you also what you were saying about the extremism definition. There are definitely issues, and I personally don't really like the distinction between violent and non-violent extremism. I think it makes more sense to talk about the specific ideologies and maybe potentially to think of conceptualizing it a little bit in terms of hard power and sharp power. The idea of violent extremism being Islamist hard power, and the more sort of subversive elements being at least analogous to the IR concept of sharp power.
Thank you. Bill?
Okay, I just think we need to be very careful. I think in Elizabeth's talk right at the beginning, there is a risk that we inflate the influence of Tommy Robinson and this so-called far right out of all proportion. They amount to very little traction and resonance in society today. They almost exist in a symbiotic relationship with the woke left. These two sides of the spectrum talk each other up endlessly and need each other to justify their narratives and existence. A very final point from me is, I think what we're looking at is a considerable amount of cultural confusion within mainstream society. I often make the point, I have more in common with the average Muslim shopkeeper on Tottenham Court Road who spends every hour of the day working day and night, trying to make as much money as possible to get their kids into a good school. I have more in common with that person than I have with a white middle-class animal rights activist who sets fire to part of Oxford University. So don't presume who your allies are, because what we're looking at in society today are divisions along cultural lines rather than what used to be understood as political ones. And that's why you see it from Trump to Brexit to the discussion of the flyover states in the United States, the periphery in France, and what David Goodhart describes as the somewheres in the United Kingdom. These are all people who are overlooked by mainstream elite culture that is dominated by academics, the media, and government. People like ourselves, but people like ourselves who ought to remember that the people who bake your bread, empty your bins, and drive your buses are not people like you.
Osama, the last word, if you can keep it really short.
Okay, so I'll quickly answer that question. I mean, training for imams, priests, rabbis is good. You know, we have paedophile priests, we have extremist rabbis in this country. And also imams don't inflate their influence also. Like many priests and rabbis, many imams are mocked and ignored by the congregation, right? And we have to look at women's groups and wider youth groups, etc. We also have female imams now, an increasing number. My final point would be, I really would like to echo what Bill was saying. I think, and I said it also, us and them engagement. I mean, this is very important, and thank you for sharing this. But I worry that the people who should be here in the room are the people we've been talking about, and we do that far too often. We should actually be talking to them and helping that conversation, having the shared values. And this is what I tried to present in my topic. There we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panel, for this. Let's give the panel a great round of applause. Because you see, we could be going on here all night, but it's time for Barry Gardner to stand up and tell us exactly what we've been talking about and the conclusions we have been drawing.
That's highly unlikely. I just wanted to start by reminding us that the title of this seminar was not terrorism in the UK, it was extremism in the UK. And I think we've tended to focus or to imagine that we should be talking about terrorism and terrorists rather than extremism. We've had gender, toxic masculinity. We've had geography, locations of integration and interaction. We've had philosophy, liberty versus security. We've had theology, which I particularly liked. I thought you might have used a trope here, because what you, of course, did was you added the letters BR to the word other. And I thought that was particularly significant, what you said about not regarding somebody as the other, but regarding them as a brother or sister, and that being the way to engage and de-radicalize, I think, was where you ended up with. We've had dialogue, robust engagement, adding the word fucker to the dialogue of rapprochement, but as a way of establishing three fundamental principles: meaning, structure, and purpose, all of which you thought were lacking. And we've had case law and jurisprudence, which took us back through a minimum age marriage, marital rape, FGM, right back to toxic masculinity. So, gender, geography, philosophy, dialogue, case law, jurisprudence, theology. I want to add one more, because I don't know if any of you know what the animal that the zookeeper fears most going into the cage with. It's not the lion, it's not the snake, it's not the Komodo dragon. It's the chimpanzee. And no, it's true. It's true. My uncle was a zookeeper. He was one of those people you call an uncle. He wasn't actually an uncle. And so I want to add zoology, because I think what we haven't done today is we haven't talked about ourselves as a species. We haven't talked of ourselves as animals. And when we're considering extremism, I think there's something we can learn. And I simply want to read to you about an animal called the booby. The booby is, many of you will know, there's a blue-footed booby in the Galapagos, but there's another booby called the Nazca booby. On the dry desert islands of the Galapagos, boobies nest close together in colonies of several thousand birds. They lay 2 eggs, from 3 days to a week apart. If both eggs hatch, the elder chick will always kill its sibling, usually pushing it out of the nest, where it will then die of thirst or starvation. The parent never intervenes, but sits sheltering the murdering chick while the victim is shoved into oblivion. A murderous fight with a brother or sister is how every Nazca booby life begins. Once the surviving chicks have grown up a little, their parents feel able to leave them and go fishing, almost always in the afternoon. That is the opportunity the young unemployed boobies, the pre-breeding adolescents, up to 10 years old, have been waiting for. Every afternoon, they turn into what Anderson has called non-parental adult visitors, or NAVs for short. NAVs patrol the colony. There are more males than females in the booby population, so most NAVs tend to be young unemployed males. When they spot an unguarded chick across the flat open ground of the colony, they fix their stare and set off determinedly towards it, looking hard at the target all the way. The very young chicks aren't bothered by them because they're still protected by their parents, and those near to fledging aren't troubled either because they can defend themselves. It's the mid-stage children, big enough to be interesting, not so big that they reject the advances of the NAVs, that receive the attention. Chicks never approach NAVs. The NAV's unwelcome visit usually lasts about 10 minutes, but can go on for an intolerable hour. The visitor sometimes simply stands by the chick, enjoying being near it, giving it presents of pebbles, sticks, feathers, gently touching and preening it just as a mother would with her own chick. These grooming love moments can develop into something far more aggressive. The NAV starts to bite and jab at the chick's body, usually the neck, the back of the head or the wing, clamping its bill around the neck and violently shaking the chick or pulling on its down. Finally, the NAV's visit climaxes in an attempt to have sex with the chick. The chick cowers, tucking in its wings and legs tight against its body, its bill deeply underneath its chest, submissively presenting no threat to the attacker, while the NAV stands on its back and paddles away with its feet looking for local contact. Sometimes in the hottest part of the afternoon, the chick will overheat, crushed close to the stony ground, and will raise itself to cool down. That summons more extreme aggression. Over 8 seasons, Anderson observed 4,945 NAV events in a small subcolony of 450 nests. Half the time the male NAVs were aggressive, a third of the time they were loving, and for 1 in 7 cases, they tried to have sex with the chick. The females were less sexual but often more violently aggressive. when the females were sexual with the chicks, they mimicked male rape. In a 2011 paper by Martina Muller and others, they published the first evidence in a non-human society of socially transmitted maltreatment directed towards unrelated young. It seems that Nazca Booby society is a victim of the cycle of violence so often encountered in the human world. It's horrific. It's quite horrific. But if we look at animal society, and if we try and understand ourselves not simply in terms of theory, not simply in terms of theology, not simply in terms of sociology and gender, but actually sometimes look at ourselves as a species, different from, but not separate from, the animal world, then perhaps we will develop a better understanding of why we have extremism in our society and how to deal with it.
Thank you, Barry. That's set me thinking, and I think all of us a lot. Finally, just before I can see the wine is being uncorked there, so we must. It's happened already. People are drinking it. Anyway, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you very much to Ajit and the Democracy Forum team for giving us an afternoon without eggshells, with no moral capitulation, with a great structure and robust debate.